turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
questions,
Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists.
Hello and welcome to The Naked Scientists, the show where we bring you the latest breakthroughs in science, technology and medicine with me, James Titko. This week, it's one of the biggest talking points for parents and teachers everywhere. What are smartphones doing for our children's development? We look at the arguments and assess the evidence.
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
Initially, the upside to children having access to a supercomputer in their pockets seemed obvious. Immediate access to the reams of educational information on the internet, seamless communications with their friends, a source of constant entertainment. But has reality lived up to this ideal? As mental ill health amongst our youngsters continues to rise, many are pointing to smartphones, and particularly the social media platforms on them, as mainly to blame. And many teachers argue they're often an obstacle to better grades. Some countries have already taken action on smartphones, like in Australia.
There's been reduced distractions in school and an improvement in academic performance, enhanced social interaction between the students.
I can't see any need for a mobile phone at school, to be honest.
But does it have to be this way? Can we harness the amazing potential of this technology in a way that avoids causing harm to developing brains? That's what we're going to be finding out today. A top neuropsychologist will tell us what the screen age is doing to our Stone Age brains. We'll look at recent studies into how adolescents and adults differ in their social media activity, and we'll examine what the evidence says about an effective ban on smartphones in schools. But first, Jo Ryrie is a parent and co-founder of Smartphone Free Childhood, a collective action campaign in the UK which is seeking to delay the age at which parents give their children these devices, staving off peer pressure in the process.
Smartphone Free Childhood started accidentally in February, and that was when my wife set up a WhatsApp group, and we realised very, very quickly that parents, the length and breadth of Britain and actually all over the world, were really, really worried about this issue that we were worried about, which is that we didn't want to give our eldest daughter, who was then 8, a smartphone. There were some other children in her class that were starting to get smartphones, and we could see that this issue was coming around the corner very, very quickly. And it turns out there were tens of thousands of other parents who felt the same way. What
are the harms that you're hearing about that you think is the reason this needs to be addressed?
The first one is obviously the correlation to the teen mental health crisis that we face today. And there was a study in 2023, I think it was nearly 30,000 young adults, that showed that the younger they got their first smartphone, the worse their mental health is today. And there's all sorts of other studies that point to a direct correlation, at the very least, between the age of first owning a smartphone and the likelihood of facing mental health problems in the future. So that's a big one. Harmful content is a huge one. Giving children unrestricted access to the internet in their pockets creates a gateway to the kind of content that we'd never dream of exposing children to in real life. Children seeing hardcore pornography or being exposed to extreme political views, sexual content, violent imagery, these kind of things have just become normal. They're kind of part of the fabric of modern childhood, and we're saying that that's not okay. There are all sorts of issues that stem from the fact that these platforms are addictive by design. The fundamental objective of these social media platforms is to maximize engagement, i.e., get people to spend as much time as possible on their platforms. That's not up for debate, that's just the business model. A young person whose brain isn't fully developed, who can't sort of control their impulses in the way that an adult can, and they're also hardwired for peer approval. And then you put it in their pockets 24/7. I think it was 29 hours a week. There's the average time that the average British 12-year-old now spends on a smartphone. That's a huge amount of time. When you start to think about what children aren't doing in that time, that becomes really, really worrying.
Indeed. I guess the central conflict there is your conviction that there's something potentially damaging about giving smartphones to young children, against the fact that if many of their peers have them, you really don't want this to damage their social standing in their peer group.
Exactly. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there. There's become a rite of passage, particularly when children transition to secondary school, so age around 11, that because everyone else in their class has got a smartphone, then you don't really have a choice but to get your child a smartphone because their social lives start to migrate online. And we think that's an impossible position. You either hand over a device that you know to be harmful, or you risk alienating your child just at the point when you want them to spread their wings and become independent. So the main thing that we're trying to do is bring parents together to agree collectively to delay giving their children smartphones, because it's very difficult to do on your own. But if 5, 10, 15, 20 parents in the same class all agree not to give their children smartphones for a few more years, then that peer pressure reduces and it becomes much, much easier conversation.
Do you have an age in mind? I'm thinking about the kind of practicalities of what success will look like for the campaign.
This is much debated. Where we've landed is end of year 9, so age 14, which is a bit more of an achievable goal than what a lot of people think is actually a safe age for a smartphone, which is 16. So we're just advocating to delay giving children smartphones for a few more years than what has currently become the norm.
I guess then it runs into the problem of the feasibility of pulling something like this off. As you say, by the end of primary school, a lot of kids have already had smartphones. By 14, I'd probably contend it's the majority of kids these days have a smartphone. Trying to reverse this almost ubiquitous possession of smartphones among young people, when some will say the horse has already bolted, perhaps we're better off moving with the times and making sure the online worlds that our children inhabit are as safe as they can be.
Yeah, look, we absolutely think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that the online world is safe, and we support anyone who's working in that space. But the situation that we find ourselves in today is one where I think everyone agrees that it's really not safe for young people to have unrestricted access to the internet in their pockets. And so we find ourselves in a position where we either just have to accept this status quo or do something about it. And it's also important to say that, nobody asked for this. We didn't vote for this. It's just happened due to the speed of this technological change that has come about in the last 5 or 10 years. And so, yes, we could just say, oh, well, the genie's out the bottle and we've just got to accept it and work within these parameters. But actually, the fundamental question we need to ask ourselves is, do we as a society and as parents feel like the status quo is okay? And if the answer is no, then we have to say, all right, let's do something about it. And yes, it's a difficult challenge because it's actually 89% of 12-year-olds in the UK have their own smartphone. So almost everyone has one. But the key to this is collective action. If we act together, then we can do something about it. And 70,000 parents have signed this parent pact that we only launched 6 weeks ago. So parents everywhere really, really want this situation to change. And if we work together and act collectively, then we can actually solve this.
Joe Ryrie from Smartphone Free Childhood. We'll be hearing more about the debate around smartphones in schools a bit later on. But what about one of Joe's central arguments, that smartphones and the platforms on them are addictive? And what other impacts could they be having on young brains as they are still developing? Richard Cytowic is a neuropsychologist and professor of neurology at George Washington University. His new book is called Your Stone Age Brain in the Screen Age.
People are familiar with physical addictions like alcohol and drugs and cigarettes, but there are also then behavioral addictions like gambling and shopping and compulsive sex, for example. And the endless scroll that you do on your phone is an example of behavioral addiction, because when do you stop? You don't, because there's no end in sight. And so it's like a slot machine that you keep playing and hoping for a hit, something interesting or funny or important is going to come up, and you just keep going at it. And that's called positive intermittent reinforcement, because you get a hit every now and then, and that's enough to keep you hooked.
Is it really inducing the brain chemistry changes associated with addiction in the same way a harmful drug does, for example?
Yes, there have been some studies, both with fMRI and tractography, that show that we're getting the same kind of physical changes with these behavioral addictions as we do with physical addictions.
So that's addiction, a serious harm in its own right. You also talk about the risks, though, of the cognitive load imposed by screen devices and whether this is impacting on our brain functions.
Well, it is. The whole reason I talk about the Stone Age brain, I think this will surprise most of your listeners, is that we operate under a fixed bandwidth of available energy. And no amount of diet, exercise, Sudoku, puzzles, or supplements is going to be able to change that. We've now reached the point where we're asking it to do so much that it's like over exercising a muscle. It fatigues and collapses.
What are the cognitive costs of that?
Well, take a look at school grades for one thing. For attention spans, everybody agrees that our attention spans have all gone to hell. It affects memory, it affects sleep, and of course, the lack of sleep affects your ability to learn or not to learn or retain what you've learned in school if you've been paying attention in the classroom instead of looking at your screens, which is what so many kids do. I mean, they don't pay attention to the teacher, they're looking at TikTok.
Quite. Once your attention span deteriorates or your memory gets worse, how easy is it to claw those capabilities back? Are younger people at a bit of an advantage perhaps in this area, in that there's time to turn it round up to the development of their brain, as you say?
Yeah, well, they still have a lot of plasticity left, but all of us have some degree of plasticity even into our 90s. So the answer is yes, it's easy. And also, no, it's really difficult. It's easy because the solution is simple. It's difficult because people don't want to do it. And that is turn the phone off, put it face down, put it in another room, go for a walk, talk to someone on the phone rather than texting them, interact in person. I mean, this is what the pandemic taught us, is that kids were doing, Zoom schooling, and they weren't getting the socialization that they need in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth grades. And that really affected their ability to interact with other people, to make small talk, for example. They're terrified of anything in person.
What's the role of face-to-face interaction for the developing brain?
Well, we're a social animal. And so socialization is where it's at. The infants and toddlers learn by imitation learning. They mimic their adults. And so that's why playing, so big in patty cake and imaginative games like restaurant or shoe store, these are imaginative exercises in socialization. So is being able to talk to other kids or their parents, their relatives and all this. The whole notion of social media, I mean, that is such a misnomer. It's not social at all. It's isolating. And that's why we see so much anxiety in young people, particularly as they head off to college for the first time. They have no idea how to navigate life. It's really sad. This is what I mean by virtual autism, is that this heavy screen exposure induces autistic-like symptoms in heavy users. So poor eye contact, verbalization, and regression of social skills. Now, if you take the phones away, these symptoms go away in a short period of time, something that never happens in real developmental autism. So the solution is easy, but the participants don't want to implement the solution.
Is that the only way to row back on the screens? Or is there a way of harnessing the potential for access to so much knowledge, to really positive opportunities to interact with the world without all the negative aspects as you've outlined them?
Of course, I mean, my iPhone is a wonderful device and a tool. I mean, it's far better than anything on Star Trek. But you have to use it wisely, realizing that, yes, it's a great boon, but it's also a narcotizing agent. And so it calls on your emotional intelligence, which is, first of all, self-awareness, the ability to regulate your own behavior, the ability to have good social skills, adaptability, and most of all, resilience. And people who are addicted to their phones don't show any of this because they're so sucked into the screen.
So this is a big call to action, really. This is something up to this point we've got badly wrong. The situation has crept up on us where children have access to these platforms and we're leaving many vulnerable to harm.
Yes, in the beginning, all the tech boosters approached this as if it were an unalloyed good. And anybody who said, gee, I don't know, maybe there's some downsides here, they were dismissed as a technophobe or a Luddite. They were explained away. And I think now the cows have come home. We're seeing the results of this. The critics would say, well, there's not enough evidence. We should wait until we have evidence. Well, that's misunderstanding the precautionary principle, which is if something might be doing harm, then don't do it, or be careful of how you're using it. Doing research like this is so complicated and multifactorial and messy that by the time we get the data that the critics want, the damage will be done. We'll be waiting forever for that evidence to come out. So in the meantime, I say, look, there's a strong likelihood that these devices are doing harm when used in excess. So how about not using them in excess?
Neuropsychologist Richard Cytowic there, and his new book, Your Stone Age Brain in the Screen Age, is available to buy now. You're listening to The Naked Scientists with me, James Titko. Today, we're investigating smartphones and adolescence. We've heard why some parents are banding together to delay giving them to their children, and heard from neuropsychologist Richard Cytowic, who's convinced of the harms of social media for developing brains. Still to come, we'll weigh up the available evidence on banning smartphones in schools. As Richard was pointing out, establishing a causal link between screen time and the rise in poor mental health outcomes for adolescents is hard to do, but work in this area is underway. A recent study showed an increased sensitivity in adolescents to a core feature of many social platforms, the like button. Most of us are familiar with it by now. Whenever you post on your favourite feed, other users have the option to engage with you by clicking like. The study, published in Science Advances, links a drop in likes with a comparatively bigger drop in mood in young people. I spoke to one of the authors of the study, Wouter van den Bos, who is an associate professor of developmental psychology at the University of Amsterdam.
There was already a data set, and it was exactly the data that we needed because it had 8,000 teenagers and 8,000 adults that were on Instagram, and it had all their posts and the likes they got on the posts. And that data could tell us how sensitive they are to the likes that they got on their posts.
How are you defining sensitivity in this sense?
Yeah. The effect that likes have on future posting and using the app. So we assume that if you get more likes, particularly more likes than you expected you would get, you are again more motivated to pick up the phone and start using the app and start posting again. And if you then don't get the likes you expect, you get sort of demotivated, and it will take longer before you start using the app again.
And the thinking underpinning that assumption is that young people, adolescents, are social creatures more so perhaps than adults. So that sensitivity would be increased.
Yes, we based our hypothesis on the fact that, we know that adolescents are really sensitive to their social environment, because also in this developmental period, there's a lot changing. You have this shift moving away a little bit from your parents, and your peer group becomes more important, and also your position within the group. So those likes might be much more important signals for them. They're much more meaningful. That's what we thought. And in a way, what we found in our data. If the adolescents got more or less likes, they were much more responsive to it. If they got more, they started posting more. If they got less, they started posting less. We also saw that pattern in adults, of course. It's not that they don't care at all, but definitely the adolescents were more sensitive to it.
So younger people are more sensitive to the amount of likes on their post. The next step, I suppose, is to necessarily say that they feel worse as a result. Maybe they just decide it's less worth their time posting. How did you show that lower likes maybe led to lower mood, for example?
Yeah, so for us, that was the next step in the second study, also really looking at their emotional states. And for this, we moved to the lab again. And basically, we built a social media simulator, an experiment in which the participants, including teenagers, they could post things from a selection of memes that we gave them, and when they posted them, they got likes based on other people's ratings. So those ratings were real. The only thing is that we manipulated behind the scenes in this app the memes they could select from. So sometimes we just gave them really poor memes, and basically that result in not so many likes. for both adults and for the adolescents, if they got more likes for a while, they reported higher mood, because we also asked these questions in between during the experiment, how they were feeling at the moment. And the mood would decline if you gave them all the bad memes and they get less likes. And specifically for the adolescents, these effects were stronger. And again, specifically for the negative mood. So they were definitely more affected by not getting the likes they expected or wanted.
What about a mechanism behind this association between reduced likes and lower mood? How are you able to say what's going on inside the brains of young people to perhaps explain why this enhanced emotional volatility is seen in relation to social media?
Well, we think there's two things going on. But one is, for them, it's much more important, the peer group. The connections they have on social media, it's 90 or more % are basically the teens and the peers that they interact with in their daily life. So basically from school and other things. If they're not getting the feedback, this is really a strong signal for not really belonging in the group in a way that they really want. And they don't have many alternatives often. The second thing is that emotion regulation itself is also sort of a skill that's still developing during this period. We know that the prefrontal cortex and the connections with the subcortical brain regions, so the smaller emotional brain regions, are still developing during those years. And we also found some intriguing sort of starting point to further explore this in a neuroimaging analysis that we also did, the third study of the whole paper, where we also found that particularly the amygdala, which is one of those emotional brain regions, was highly correlated with the sensitivity to the social feedback on Instagram. That really stands out as one because it was also correlated with social anxiety and problematic social media use. So I think regulating the activity in that area could be really helpful to deal with the feedback that they get online.
How does this knowledge potentially help us to reduce harms from smartphones? I know Instagram had a push recently to remove the like counter from posts, and they also have more recently been developing accounts specifically for adolescents to mitigate some of the predispositions they have to having a difficult time on social media. Are those steps in the right direction?
Here we've only focused, of course, on one element, the likes, and there's other things that also in very different ways might be very dangerous. But if we talk about the likes, I think that's definitely a good step. Of course, it was only optional and it was still sort of visible, but not entirely. And it's still easy to give the likes. And I think it would be nice if we could focus really on making those interactions online a little bit more meaningful, strip it away even more.
Is that something that the social media companies will be happy with? Wouter van den Bos, Associate Professor of Developmental Psychology at the University of Amsterdam. Instead of trying to modify online spaces, what about a more prescriptive approach? We mentioned Australia earlier, where smartphones are banned in public schools, and this is something currently being debated in the UK as well. Could this approach have a positive impact on grades and mental health? What about the potential upsides to having access to phones in schools? Sonia Livingstone is a director of the Digital Futures for Children programme at LSE. She co-authored a recent report titled, "Does the Evidence Support a School Ban on Smartphones?"
There's surprisingly little evidence given the amount of publicity that this issue is getting, but what exists is a mixture of some studies showing keeping smartphones out of class improves children's academic outcomes, and some research doesn't really show any effects at all. And we think that's partly because schools aren't really implementing outright bans. They have all kinds of nuances. So there's kind of weak evidence that restricting smartphones in class is helpful, and a little evidence that the benefits are particularly strong for children who are more disadvantaged or struggling in school, and that kind of makes sense. They may need more support to concentrate and learn.
In terms of the counterpoints, what are the potential benefits of having smartphones in schools?
Well, for a long time, we have thought as a society that children with having smartphones in school could support their learning, especially if it's embedded within the curriculum and teachers, know when to call on children to use their phones because they're powerful computers. They can enable personalized learning. They can enable children to kind of pursue their particular interests. And they're also useful for linking how children learn at home and at school because they can take work there, halfway through, or they can complete work elsewhere, or they can bring something they've done from home into school and so on. So, as a device that connects spaces of learning and offers children kind of child-led, personally motivated opportunities for learning, the potential is considerable. I think what we're doing at the moment is schools find it too hard to control how children use their smartphone in class. So schools would prefer, if they have the funding, to provide children with school-owned tablets or laptops.
Broadening our conversation out now, we've been hearing throughout the programme that social media is addictive by design, takes children away from the activities that are crucial to their healthy development, playing face-to-face, sleep, of course. Do we see these harms borne out in any of the studies when comparing children who have less smartphone use?
I think we can certainly see evidence that children who use their phones a lot are more likely to report some adverse outcomes like losing sleep or missing out on social interaction, or indeed seeing their school grades drop. The children who don't use the phone very much at all, some research says they miss out on the kind of social interaction and the peer culture that is part of school life and part of growing up. And the ones in the middle, the ones who use it a kind of what's become a normal amount, if you like, we see all kinds of outcomes. For some children, it gets in the way, it becomes a problem, they don't feel quite in control of it. For other children, it's a welcome relief or a source of relaxation or fun. So, the outcomes of using the phone are about as variable as our children's lives. And that's why it's so hard to summarize. It's not that there are no effects, but there are lots of different effects depending on children's backgrounds and starting points and what it is they want to do with the phone. I do think on your point about addiction, we have seen a shift in what the phone represents in the last few years from a fantastic device that children can do many things with to a device that increasingly has apps on it that are designed to grab and hold children's attention. And, so if we can separate the phone from some of the apps and platforms on it, we might want to talk about restricting use of some of those apps or thinking again how to support children to use them in a way that is healthy for them and not excessive.
What about raising the age limit for social media, which stands at 13 for the most popular platforms, to 16, for example?
Well, I would much rather see restrictions on the platforms than I would restrictions on the children. So rather than raising the age limit because social media offers children lots of benefits, I would rather see platforms being required to produce an age-appropriate service for teenagers. So for teenagers, they could be required, and in some ways, they are now being required by regulation, not to use the most addictive and attention-grabbing algorithms and not to collect children's data and kind of use it in ways that are not healthy or beneficial for them. So I think, there are ways that we should be regulating the platforms to serve children better. I'll refer to research that I've done with children and young people because they themselves have a really kind of long and smart list of what they want to see. And it's a mix of fewer features that grab their attention, like better control over autoplay or endless scroll, more control over the algorithms so that they don't find themselves in those kind of rabbit holes of negative content. And it's better reporting functions and quicker takedown so that when children and people do report problematic content, something is done about it promptly. it does feel sometimes like the platforms are kind of dragging their heels and only making the changes when they are made to, rather than, seeing what is truly beneficial for young people and serving their audience better, which I think is likely to be better for their business as well as for young people.
That was Sonia Livingstone from the LSE. It seems we'll have to wait a bit longer before we can say anything definitive about the harms of smartphones for students. But does that mean we should be delaying our interventions? That might be all we have time for here on the programme today, but we know this is an issue that's got a lot of people talking, and we'd love to hear your thoughts too. You can reach us on chris@thenakedscientists.com. That's it for today. Join us next week when we're weighing up weight loss drugs. Is Ozempic a shot in the arm for a sluggish economy? The Naked Scientists comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It's supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm James Titko, and from everyone here at The Naked Scientists, thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.